Today, we're diving into one of the most intense and honestly foundational texts in the entire Torah, Acharei Kedoshim. It's a section that really makes us grapple with these huge questions of purity, atonement, and what it even means to build a holy society. It poses a question that just echoes through time. What does it actually mean to be holy? And hey, just a quick note before we jump in, if you're into exploring more content that connects this ancient wisdom with modern ideas, you can find us on Telegram. All right, let's get to the heart of it.
You know, when you boil it all down, this whole portion is wrestling with one central question. What is true holiness? And maybe even more for us today, how can we in our busy modern lives possibly answer that call to be holy? That's the journey we're going on right now.
So where do we start? Well, we start at the absolute peak of sanctity, the incredibly detailed and, frankly, awe-inspiring service of the high priest on the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. You know, the way the Torah sets the stage here is fascinating. It doesn't just give us a list of rituals. It starts with this incredibly solemn warning, reminding everyone about the tragic deaths of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu. Right away, the immense gravity of the situation is established. This tells us that approaching the sacred isn't something casual. The stakes are unbelievably high.
And at the absolute center of this service is this one space, the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Holy of Holies. This was the innermost room of the tabernacle. Now, think about how exclusive this was. It was entered only once a year by only one person, the high priest, on this one single day. This was seen as the literal meeting point between heaven and earth.
On this day, the high priest's whole appearance was totally different. He had to take off his usual magnificent golden vestments, the ones designed to show splendor and glory, and instead he put on simple, pure white linen garments. This is such a powerful shift. It symbolizes that on this day, it's not about human glory at all. It's about total purity, total humility, and just raw atonement before God. The actual flow of the service reveals this really deep psychology. It doesn't start with the whole nation, it starts with the leader himself. The high priest first has to bring an offering to atone for himself and his own family. It's a powerful statement that you can't lead others to purity without first looking inward. Only then does the ritual broaden to include everyone, focusing on these two identical goats. And then comes the climax, a moment of terrifying closeness as the high priest enters the Holy of Holies, all alone, shielded only by a cloud of incense. After that, he uses the blood of the sacrifices to purify the holy space, and finally, he performs this incredible act of transference, confessing all the nation's sins over that second goat.
And those two goats, this is where we see the dual nature of atonement so brilliantly illustrated. I mean, they start out identical, right? They represent the single fate of the nation, but then a divine lottery, separates them onto two completely opposite paths. The goat for God is all about atonement through closeness. Its blood is brought into the holiest place on earth, symbolizing bringing the people closer to God. But the goat for Azazel, the scapegoat, is the opposite. It represents atonement through removal. It gets sent away, banished to the wilderness, literally carrying the sins of the people far, far away. It's this incredible 1-2 punch. We get closer to God while our sins are cast out.
The Torah just captures this moment with such powerful imagery. And the goat shall bear upon it all their iniquities to a desolate land. You can almost feel it. It's a physical acting out of a spiritual idea. This idea of transferring guilt and the collective sigh of relief that comes from seeing it completely removed from the community. And, while all this high-stakes drama is happening in the sanctuary, the entire nation has a role to play. For every single person, Yom Kippur is called a Shabbat Shabbaton, a Sabbath of Sabbaths. It's a day of total rest from work and also a day of fasting. The idea is that everyone's focus is supposed to turn inward, toward repentance and atonement, mirroring what the high priest is doing on their behalf. Okay, so after that peak experience of Yom Kippur, the Torah kind of shifts gears. It moves from this extraordinary once-a-year event to the principles that are supposed to define holiness every single day. And it starts with setting sacred boundaries around worship and the sanctity of life itself. Right away, a really crucial rule gets laid down: the centralization of worship. All animal offerings have to be brought to the one central holy place. And the text is serious about this. It says offering a sacrifice in the open field is like shedding blood. It's a huge deal. And this wasn't just about geography. It was a total break from the pagan cultures all around them, where everyone had their own little personal altars. This was about keeping the community's worship unified and pure. And this brings us to what is maybe the key verse for this whole section, the idea that underpins so much of what's to come. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. Wow. The Torah makes this direct, powerful link. Blood is the life force. It represents the nephesh, the soul of a living thing. If you get this one idea, everything else about sacrifices and consumption starts to make sense.
So this core principle, that blood equals life, it gives rise to this whole ethic of reverence. It leads directly to a strict ban on consuming blood. Why? Because blood has a sacred job, atonement on the altar. It's not for us to just casually eat. And this respect for life goes beyond the altar. Even when an animal is just being prepared for a meal, its life force has to be honored. The blood is to be poured out and covered with earth. It's this beautiful, symbolic act of returning life back to its source.
Okay, so we've gone from the sanctuary to the altar. Now, the lens of holiness zooms in even closer, right into the most personal parts of our lives, the family, the home, and the basic structure of society. This is the part of the Torah that lays out the blueprint for how Israel is supposed to be a nation that stands apart. God lays out a very clear choice here. Like, two distinct paths are set before the people. On one side, you have the ways of Egypt, where they just came from, and the ways of Canaan, where they're going. And the Torah describes both as morally corrupt. On the other side, you have God's statutes, a blueprint for a holy society. The message is crystal clear. Don't look back to what you left, and don't just blend in with the culture around you. You have to follow this unique path. So what does this unique path actually look like? Well, it's defined by a set of clear moral boundaries that are meant to create a stable and sacred structure for families and for society. The Torah strictly forbids things like incestuous relationships, adultery, and other forms of sexual immorality, and it also includes the idolatrous practices that were common back then, like the horrific ritual of sacrificing children to the idol Molech. These laws were designed to build a society that was radically different from its neighbors, one built on dignity, stability, and a very clear sense of what is sacred. Now, listen to the language the Torah uses to describe what happens if you ignore these boundaries. It's incredibly visceral. It says that the people who lived in the land of Israel before defiled it with their behavior, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. I mean, what an incredible idea. It suggests this deep, almost metaphysical connection between how people behave and the stability of the land itself. It's like the land has a moral compass, and it just can't tolerate that level of corruption. And the warning to Israel is stark. Don't make the same mistakes, or the land will vomit you out too. So we've gone from the highest heights of the Holy of Holies to the laws of the altar and right down to the intimate rules of the home. You might be asking, how does all this stuff connect? Well, the Torah pulls all these seemingly separate laws together with one single powerful, unifying statement. And the answer comes in this one phrase that gets repeated over and over again. As these sections of law finish, the Torah stamps them with this signature: I am the Lord your God. And this isn't just a sign-off, like saying the end. It's the ultimate reason. It's the why behind every single one of these commandments. Why should you be holy? Why must you separate yourselves from these other practices? Because I am the Lord your God. Your holiness is meant to be a reflection of my holiness. It's all rooted in the relationship. So as we pull it all together, you can start to see this beautiful integrated system. From that once-a-year service in the holiest place on earth, to the daily act of reverence by covering blood, to the sacred boundaries that define a family, these aren't just a random list of rules. They are all interconnected pathways. Every one of them is designed to carve out a space for the sacred in our world. And together, they form a complete system for building not just a holy society, but a holy life, a life that consciously tries to mirror the holiness of God. And that brings us to one last really important thought. Everything we've talked about so far, going through the text, is kind of like the body of these commandments. But like any living thing, they also have a soul, a deep inner dimension. Because really, it's so important to remember that everything we've covered today is just a glimpse, just a taste. To truly get a handle on the inner life of these concepts, what they mean beyond just time and space, that requires a much deeper dive. The profound teachings you find in the mystical traditions of Kabbalah and Chassidut, that's where these eternal ideas really come to life. If this whole exploration has sparked your curiosity and you want to start that deeper journey, you can find a whole range of materials at Kabbalah for the beginner. Thanks so much for joining us. May we all be inspired to find our own way to build a holier world, one sacred act at a time. All right, today we're jumping into one of the most foundational texts ever written about how to live, Parahat Kedoshim.
We're going to unpack this massive concept we hear all the time, but, rarely get into the nitty-gritty of what it actually means to be holy.
So the whole thing kicks off with this just radical command. And get this, it's not for a special few like priests or prophets. It's for the entire nation. The idea is that their unique relationship with God demands a reflection of God's own character. It's a challenge to mirror a divine quality, not just as an individual, but as a whole society. I mean, it's a beautiful thought, right? But what does that actually look like on a Tuesday afternoon? Is it a feeling you're supposed to have? Some kind of mystical state of mind? Well, the text's answer is surprisingly practical and down to earth. So let's dig into the specific instructions to see how this grand idea gets translated into real life. Okay, before we go any further, we have to get this one key term down, Kedusha. Yeah, we translate it as holiness, but it's not really about just being pious. It's about separation. The text defines it as being actively set apart from certain behaviors, from certain transgressions. So think of it as a process, right? An active process of drawing lines and making very deliberate distinctions in the world. So where does this whole idea of separation even begin? Not up in the heavens, but right here on earth. I mean, literally, in the dirt. The very first example of holiness is rooted in farming, something that everyone back then would have understood completely. This is where you really see holiness as an act of restraint. So picture this. You plant a new fruit tree. You can't just grab the fruit whenever you want. For 3 full years, it's totally off limits. Then, in year 4, the harvest is called sacred praise. It's dedicated to God and eaten in Jerusalem. And only in the 5th year is it finally yours to use. I mean, talk about building patience and gratitude right into the food system. And listen, this is not just some symbolic exercise. The text makes a direct promise here. It says, if you follow these rules of restraint and dedication, you will be rewarded with an abundant harvest. It creates this very real, tangible link between acting in a holy way and the prosperity of the land itself. So, okay, holiness starts with the land, but it definitely doesn't stop there. The whole concept expands outward from what one person does to the responsibilities of the entire community. And this is where that idea of separation becomes even more critical. It's about defining who you are by what you are not. The text draws some incredibly sharp lines here. It explicitly forbids practices that were common in neighboring cultures, like the absolutely horrific worship of Molech, or consulting with necromancers and fortune tellers, what the text calls forces of impurity. This isn't just a friendly suggestion. It's a defiant rejection of a totally different spiritual path. And this is absolutely crucial. Holiness isn't a private hobby. It's a communal project. The text gives a stark warning that if the community sees these things happening and just looks the other way, God will step in directly and punish not only the person who did it, but their family and everyone else who let it happen through their silence. And just to show how incredibly seriously these boundaries were taken, the text is, well, it's unambiguous. For these specific spiritual violations, which were seen as corrupting the very soul of the nation, the prescribed penalty was death. In this framework, it was seen as a matter of national survival. Okay, so from the community, the lens of holiness zooms in even tighter to the most intimate space there is, the family. The integrity of the household is shown to be the foundational building block for a holy nation. And here we go again, holiness defined by boundaries. The text lays out crystal clear rules about intimacy. It prohibits things like incest and bestiality, along with other specific sexual acts. And it also sets up laws of ritual purity. The whole point was to create a very distinct, sacred family structure that was different from the cultures all around them. And the focus keeps getting more and more specific, moving from the structure of the family right down to the food on the table. The daily, totally mundane act of eating is elevated. It becomes an opportunity to practice holiness. And this brings that whole theme of separation right to your dinner plate. The dietary laws, kashrut, command the people to make a distinction between what the text calls pure and impure animals. And according to the source, this daily act of choosing what to eat and what to avoid is one of the main ways Israel is supposed to become unique, to become distinct from every other nation. So, we've seen holiness in farming, in the community, in the family, even in our food. But you have to ask yourself, why? What's the ultimate point of all these incredibly demanding rules? Well, this final section connects all those dots to the nation's destiny. This table really just lays out the core logic of the entire parasha.
Each sphere of life has a holy action tied to it, and each action is directly linked to the nation's fate. So you reject idolatry in order to inherit the land. You uphold family purity to remain in the land. You keep kosher to be a nation set apart. In short, holiness is presented as the very condition for existing as a nation in its land.
And the text does not mince words about what happens if they fail. It actually personifies the land of Israel, describing it as having a kind of moral sensitivity. And if the people adopt the practices of the nations who were there before them, the text warns that the land itself will vomit you out. It's such a powerful, visceral image of what happens when you're just not compatible. And all of this leaves us with a pretty profound question for today. This entire system of holiness, in agriculture, community, family, it's all presented as the key to possessing a very specific piece of land. So what does holiness mean when that physical connection to the land changes? What does it mean for a people that's now scattered across the globe? How do these ancient ideas of separation and sanctity translate into our modern world? Now that's a question we're thinking about. You know, if you're into these kinds of deep dives, exploring things like AI, spiritual messages, and Hasidic wisdom, you should definitely check out the Telegram channel on your screen. It's a great resource. Okay, so glad you're here. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're jumping into what is seriously considered the very heart of the Torah, Parahat Kedoshim. Now this portion is just packed with laws, but what's amazing is that they all orbit around one single massive idea: holiness. But what does that even mean? How do you live holiness today? Well, that's what we're going to explore together. All right, let's get right to the source. The whole thing kicks off with this just monumental command. And it's not whispered to one person, it's declared to the entire nation of Israel: be holy. Simple, right? But the reason it gives is the real game changer. For I, the Lord your God, am holy. So right away, we're being asked to imitate God, to model our lives on the ultimate source of holiness itself. And that immediately raises the big question for our entire explainer today. How on earth can we, as physical people, imitate something infinite? What does a life of holiness actually look like? So what does the Torah mean by this? Well, it's not about, floating a few inches off the ground in some kind of mystical trance. It's actually way more practical than that. The classic commentators point out that the Hebrew word for holy, kadosh, really means to be separate, to be distinct. So this is a call to separate ourselves from all the negative stuff, from behaviors that drag us down. Why? So we can mirror God's own sanctity. It's something you do, an active choice, not just a state you're in. Let's dig into this idea of kedusha, or holiness, a little more. In the Torah's view, holiness isn't some fuzzy spiritual feeling. It's a path you walk, paved with choices. It's about saying no to certain things, especially the kind of moral chaos that was everywhere back then, and frankly is still tempting today. But it's not just about saying no. You separate from the negative so you can dedicate yourself to something higher. It's about choosing to be set apart, not because you're better, but because you have a unique and elevated purpose. And what I find so amazing is that the Torah doesn't just leave holiness as this lofty spiritual idea. Nope, it immediately brings it right down to earth, literally. The very first examples of how to be holy are about agriculture and social laws. This tells you right from the start that holiness is meant to be lived right here, in our messy, everyday lives, not just thought about in our heads. And here is a perfect, tangible example. Okay, imagine you plant a brand new fruit tree. The second you see fruit, you want to eat it, right? Of course. But the Torah says, hold on. For the first 3 years, that fruit is called orla. It's off limits. You can't have it. This teaches patience, self-control, and just acknowledging where it came from. Then, year 4 comes, and the fruit gets this special status, Kodesh Halulim, holy praises. It's brought to Jerusalem and eaten with joy and gratitude. Only after that whole 4-year process does the fruit become regular, everyday food. It's like a built-in lesson that sanctifies time itself, teaching us that true enjoyment comes after we first recognize the real source of the blessing. And get this isn't just about character development. The Torah draws a direct line from this act of holiness to a physical reward. It basically says, when you do this, when you practice this restraint and dedication, I will increase your produce for you. This is huge. It's teaching that holiness isn't about giving up on worldly success. Actually, it's the very thing that elevates our physical world and makes it more abundant. It's supposed to have a real positive impact on your life. Okay, so we've covered holiness in the land. Now the Torah pivots to an area that's even more crucial, our spiritual lives. If holiness with trees required patience, spiritual holiness demands something way more intense, a complete and total rejection of paganism and any impure spiritual paths. This is where we have to draw a very clear line in the sand. Now, the Torah specifically calls out the worship of Molech. And to get how serious this is, you have to understand this wasn't just bowing to a different statue. This was an actively evil practice that involved sacrificing children to fire. It was the absolute polar opposite of everything the Torah stands for. It was cruelty over compassion, death over life. To even get near this stuff was to fundamentally defile the name of God.
And right alongside Molech, the Torah forbids going to people who practice Av and Yadani. Think of these as different kinds of sorcery, like trying to talk to the dead or channeling spirits to get information. So why is this so bad? Because it's a spiritual betrayal. It's looking for a shortcut, a cheat code to get knowledge and power. It's an attempt to bypass the real, challenging, faith-filled relationship with God and instead tap into dark, unreliable, and impure forces. This chart just lays out the choice so clearly. The Torah says, look, there are two roads you can go down to find answers. On one side, you have the path of holiness, connecting to God through prophecy, through the wisdom of the Torah, through your own direct prayer. On the other side, you've got the path of impurity, trying to get answers from necromancy, soothsaying, sorcery. And the Torah's message is crystal clear. You can't have a foot in both worlds. To be holy means you pick one path and you completely leave the other one behind.
And the warning for choosing that wrong path? Wow, it's one of the most intense in the whole Torah. It's not just a minor penalty. The text uses this incredibly personal language that God himself will set his face against that person. The imagery is of a relationship being totally severed. And notice, it's not just the individual. The warning extends to their family and even to the whole community if they know about it and just look the other way. That introduces this idea of a shared spiritual responsibility.
And the consequences are spelled out in no uncertain terms. For the ultimate act of spiritual impurity, worshiping Molech, the human court is supposed to carry out the death penalty. For consulting with these forbidden spiritual guides, the penalty is death by stoning. And if the community fails to act, the Torah says there's an even higher court, direct divine retribution. The severity here just hammers home how critical this idea of spiritual loyalty is. These aren't just personal mistakes. They're seen as an attack on the very soul of the nation.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? When you boil it all down, it's this. The path of holiness demands exclusive commitment. It's not a spiritual buffet where you can pick a little of this and a little of that. It demands total, unwavering loyalty to one God as the only source of truth and guidance. It means making a clean break from any other spiritual paths that draw from impure places. In the world of the spirit, there's just no middle ground. Okay, so from the field and the spiritual world, this principle of holiness now zooms into the most personal, intimate space we have, our family. And the Torah teaches that the family isn't just a private little unit. It's the primary workshop where holiness is built, generation after generation. Parahat Kedoshim gets very specific here, laying out all these laws about forbidden relationships. And it's so important to see the goal behind them. This isn't just about limiting people, it's about building something. These laws create a framework of sanctity. They create clear, healthy boundaries that allow for dignity and respect, creating a stable, sacred container for our most powerful emotions. The family is the basic building block of a holy nation, and these laws are the blueprint.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, these are personal rules, private morality, but the Torah makes this incredible link between what happens in the home and what happens to the entire nation. So we have to ask the question, what in the world is the connection between the purity of individual families and the destiny of an entire people?
And the answer is just stunning. The Torah says explicitly that the reason the previous nations were kicked out of the land was because of their immoral practices. It says the land itself vomited them out. And then it warns the Israelites, don't do what they did or the land will vomit you out too. The message couldn't be clearer. The ability to even have and hold on to the promised land is directly tied to upholding this holiness within the family. The moral health of the nation, starting in the home, is the ticket to the dance. Okay, we've gone from the land to the soul to the family, and now this idea of holiness expands to cover the most basic thing we do every single day, eating. Through the laws of kashrut, keeping kosher, the Torah shows that no part of life is too mundane to be elevated. It turns a simple act of eating into a constant spiritual exercise. By telling us to distinguish between pure and impure foods, the Torah turns eating from just a biological need into a spiritual discipline. Suddenly, the choice of what's on your plate becomes a daily, physical reminder of your commitment to holiness.
Keeping kosher is a constant practice of self-control and mindfulness. Every single meal becomes a little statement, a declaration of who you are and the unique path you're on, spoken not with words, but with what you eat. All right, so we've been on quite a journey, from the farm to our spiritual choices, to our family, all the way down to our dinner plate. We've seen how that one powerful command to be holy isn't a single point, but a ripple that touches every part of our lives. So let's take a step back and pull all these threads together to see the whole picture. And this really shows how it all fits together. Holiness isn't just one thing, it's like a series of expanding circles. It all starts at the center, with the intention, that personal choice to be holy. From there, it radiates out into our society, changing how we deal with the world and with other people. That then shapes our spirit, demanding that exclusive loyalty to God. And that spiritual core becomes the foundation for the family, creating a sacred space. And finally, it reaches our own individual body, elevating even eating into a holy act. Each circle builds on the last, creating this whole integrated life of purpose. But here's something really important to keep in mind. Everything we've talked about today, this entire explainer, is really just scratching the surface. It's the body of these commandments. It's an absolutely essential taste. But if you want to understand the soul of these ideas, the inner spiritual meaning, the deep mystical reasons that go beyond time and space, you have to dive into the teachings of Kabbalah and Chassidut. That's where you start to understand not just what we do, but the profound cosmic why behind it all. So, if you're feeling that pull to go deeper, to continue this journey of discovery, the Kabbalah for Beginners website is a really great place to start. You'll find tons of materials there to guide you. Thanks so much for joining us for this